Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. And when I was asked to moderate this panel, initially I was humbled and I was really sort of excited to do that. But then when I was told who was going to be on the panel, I actually felt quite intimidated. And I thought, wow, this is, some of the people here really know what they're talking about when it comes to the sorts of trade-offs that we'll get into discussing. So we're going to enter into a bit of a conversation about what those trade-offs might be, what the sorts of issues that might emerge. And as I was trying to gather my thoughts around this, I started to really think, well, why is this conversation coming to become topical right now? So you almost have to be living under a rock not to realize that over the last few years, ethics has become the hot topic. But if you were looking at conferences and the conference agendas of 2014, 2015, 2016, actually you would have found that apart from some of the academic conferences and a few very specialist spaces, ethics was not on the conference agenda. It was something that was defined, refined, and localized around those specialist communities. Since about 2017, it's become part of the mainstream. It's something that is being picked up in the media. There seems to be a daily story around some sort of ethical dilemma or issue. Why is that? I think one of the reasons is that since 2017, we have seen some very high-profile issues emerge. For example, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, something the ICO and the Commissioner has pursued as an investigation and taken action on. But not just that. Across the health sector, retail, finance, across policing and justice, almost any sector that is starting to think about how to use data, how to derive some value, deliver a return to the customer, and is thinking of using automation or algorithms, is starting to have to grapple with some of these dilemmas, these trade-offs. Something else has happened in the last year or so, which is really strange as well. Big tech and small tech has started to really open up to this conversation and has started to suggest things that maybe we wouldn't have expected. About a year ago, Microsoft called for regulation of facial recognition technology, or rather, at least there should be a discussion about it. Over the last week or so, Mark Zuckerberg has really talked about the regulation of the internet and to try and address some of the harms that have been seen. And just over the last week, we've seen Google instantiate an AI ethics panel only to close it down. All of these questions really bring to life the fact that all of these issues bring to life the fact that these things aren't easy to grapple with. And not only is civil society trying to understand what to do alongside government, but so is the technology sector. So to try and make this something that for all of you, and I gather that most of you are data protection officers, for you to have something to take away that you can use in your organizations and your industries, what I'd like to do is really ask the panel to address three key questions, and we'll spin off these. The first one is the law not enough? So we've had nearly a year of GDPR. GDPR provided a framework within which we can all operate and demonstrate compliance. It really forced us to think about the sorts of issues that might manifest. It actually asks you to think about some of the ethical trade-offs that you might need to deal with. So what are the sorts of things that actually GDPR on its own doesn't address? What are the sorts of questions in your sector that you might have to grapple with? Is it the pace of technology development and innovation? Are you able to keep up to speed with that? Are regulators able to keep up to speed? That's a question that we all need to grapple with. The second question is, let's zoom in on some of those ethical trade-offs. Are they sector-specific? Should we focus our energy around the health sector or maybe into retail? What about social care? What are the sorts of areas within your sectors as well where you might need to really ask those questions about what is the thing that if we don't pay attention to this, we might suddenly find that our customers, the communities that we represent, might suffer some harm, where we need to put in extra protections, we need to go above compliance. And then finally, because this topic, ethics in data, ethics of AI, ethics of algorithms, has become so hot over the last couple of years, I have to ask myself the question, is this just virtue signaling? Are we just really suggesting that actually the debates that we're having are enough, that we can pat ourselves on the back because we sort of talked through the sorts of challenges we might face? Or actually, is there practical action that we need to take and we are taking that is really going to take this debate into a meaningful change for the people that we all represent, our customers, citizens at large? I want to open the panel discussion first by going to Lanah, and I'll introduce, in fact, let me please introduce all of our speakers first, because to help us through this complex conversation, but hopefully to make it really interesting, we have assembled, as I said, an expert panel. Lanah Kammourieh Donnelly is policy manager, public policy manager at Google. very recently, and I think this is only of the last week or two, your remit has expanded to becoming global public policy manager. Is that right?
We now have a global team, right? Instead of a team focused on Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, the team looking at privacy has been merged into one.
Fantastic. Alongside Lanah here, just to my right, we have Anthony Walker, Deputy CEO of Tech UK. We have Amy Chan, who is visiting us from Hong Kong. Amy is the head of complaints and represents the Hong Kong office of the Privacy Commissioner. Next to Amy, we have Simon McDougall, Executive Director of Technology Policy and Innovation at the ICO. And just to Simon's right, we have Louise Pakseresht, who is representing the Center for Data Ethics and Innovation. And finally, but last but by no means least, we have Dr. David Leslie. David is an ethics fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. Now, as was said, you can go and Google all of the bios. You will be suitably impressed. We're not going to go in any more detail about the reason that everyone is on the stage. They thoroughly deserve to be. What we're going to do is understand them and understand their perspectives a little bit more through the conversation. So, Lanah, just first to you. Why is it that the Google AI Ethics Board, which feels like a great endeavor, something that industry needs to do more and needs the likes of Google and other big tech to do more, why was it established and then closed down within a week? And I understand one dimension is the sort of makeup of the people that were represented. We don't necessarily need to go into personalities here, but the other issue that comes to mind is if Google was able to close that panel down within a week, did it really have any teeth? Was it ever going to have real say in the sorts of product decisions that Google might need to make around the use of data and innovative technologies like AI and machine learning? Can you just...
Absolutely. Yes, it was going to have a real say. It was going to be an advisory body, but with real influence. And the reason why the panel was put forward as an idea was that, as you may know, last summer, our CEO, Sundar Pichai, adopted and made public a number of commitments of AI principles that he has committed the company to and that Google has committed to internally. And these principles have been made public. They're available online. So they lay out what we will pursue with AI, making sure AI is socially beneficial, for example, making sure fairness is taken into account, that discrimination is fought. It details the applications of AI we will not pursue, such as AI that is harmful, AI used in weaponry. And the council that was being set up was part and parcel of taking these principles forward and bringing it to life. What we have found over the past days and weeks is that in the current time, this council is not able to go forward. This does not mean that we do not want to take into consideration external feedback and external opinions. That is what the council was for, and we look forward to doing that in the future, perhaps in a different form.
And Anthony, just picking up on that point, what's the lesson for wider industry? Because Tech UK represents a broad range of different companies. What's the wider lesson for how do you mobilize some of the discussion that is happening around the ethics of data protection and emerging technology into something practically that you can actually drive through your business?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that the board wasn't able to progress at Google. I mean, undoubtedly, there were some real world-class experts on these big questions around the ethical use and application of technology, people like Joanna Bryson and Luciano Floridi. I mean, real leading lights. But I think what it also reflects is when we're talking about issues of ethics and technology, we're also talking about politics, and we're also talking about kind of political choices. And when you're doing it in the full glare of public view, I think it shows that these can be difficult issues for companies to deal with. So you have a company who is trying to do the right thing, setting up a board, trying to be diverse in terms of making sure that you've got a broad range of views on that board, that you're not just taking people with a particular kind of outlook, but then you get criticism for the views of one particular person on that board. I mean, I think what it says if I look at it from the other end of the spectrum, if you're a small company, a kind of a startup who's just getting going, but who've got big plans and big ambitions to scale, then it kind of suggests the lesson is you need to get into these issues early. And because for me, the really successful approach to ethical decision making within companies is all about culture. And really, I think the lesson for many companies is, how are you going to embed ethical thinking and ethical decision making in the way that you operate on a daily basis? Because that's really going to be the way to do this. It's a lot harder to try and kind of strap kind of ethical frameworks or ethical boards onto a business when it's a big global kind of business that's very much in the public view. So I think the message for smaller companies is, start to engage with these issues early on, think about how you're going to address them, and think about how you drive that kind of culture change that can make a difference. And I think this is where kind of the link to data protection comes, because many of the thought processes that you need to go through will be very similar to the approach that you take around data protection. So I think the practice and expertise of data protection, I think, will be very important in addressing a much wider range of ethical questions related to the evolution of new technologies.
Simon, just to bring you in at this point, the perspectives that Anthony and Lanah have sort of described around, we really want to do good in this space and accept the sorts of communities in organizations that are considering these ethical questions, but there's a political dimension to this, but also there's a difficulty around mobilizing this. What's the sort of role that the ICO plays in doing that? How much has this debate shifted the sorts of things that you need to think about in your role at the ICO in incentivizing good practice in this space amongst DPOs?
Well, in one way, it's shifting the debate as we go, and we've got a whole range of initiatives I'll touch on in a second. But we need to keep in mind this debate is going along in parallel to the GDPR. And if you think about the GDPR as a big bang that happened about a year ago, and after the big bang, the universe suddenly shot out and is expanding in different directions. And the GDPR is still shooting out and expanding in different directions and evolving, and we're still understanding our scope around GDPR at the same time as this ethics debate going on. So that's the first key thing, I think, is that this is a very dynamic discussion where, on the one hand, we have these concepts of ethics, and we can sometimes get quite focused on what is ethics in addition to privacy. Is it to do with non-personal data? Is it to do with additional societal harms? But at the same time, really the big overlap is still between privacy and ethics. We're still talking about fairness and accountability. There's an awful lot of overlap. And so at the ICO, we're kind of evolving all the time in terms of how we're dealing with GDPR, because it is a fast-evolving area, and everybody in this room is evolving with us on that, and we're still not quite a year on. And ethics comes along at the same time. So in terms of what we're doing at the ICO, it is focused on some of the more action-oriented, practical side of things. We can delve into the theory, but there's lots of great thinkers already, including the CDI, including Turing. So we're focused on the more the practical side. So we've got 3 initiatives I'd highlight now. One is quite a mundane one, but I think is probably very useful for many people in the room. We set up an AI and regulators group where we're meeting with other regulators in the UK, because the ICO is a horizontal regulator and a world of vertical regulators. And we felt we could convene and help other regulators discuss issues around AI and how they're dealing with regulating AI in their sectors. And that's very early days, but it means that we're trying to compare notes on important issues such as vulnerable customers and how that is dealt with in terms of use of AI and data in financial services or in utilities or in gambling. So comparing notes there is good, and if you're in one particular sector, it means you're getting consistency with other sectors. We're doing work with the Turing on explainable AI, and some of you would have gone along to workshops on that earlier, so that's a really important piece of work. And some of you would have seen the blogs we've put out around developing a framework for auditing AI. And this is one of our big initiatives for this year. And this is how we are developing piece by piece a way of going in for the ICO and auditing the use of personal data in artificial intelligence, and in doing so articulating what we think good looks like in the use of AI. And the ethical use of data in those circumstances. So those things are quite important, big initiatives for us that are really trying to put some flesh on the bones of this debate.
In many ways, the last one that you've described also touches on something, Amy, that you've been really working on, which is how to describe what good looks like when it comes to the use of AI. So there's an AI framework that you've been really instrumental in pushing through in Hong Kong. Can you elaborate on what were the motivations? Was it similar to what Simon's described? Or actually, did you think that your community, the people you represent, have a different need that you're trying to address?
I think, like Hong Kong and many other jurisdictions, the personal data protections law are, usually built on a legal framework based on the principles of notifications, consent, and transparency. It may well serve for the development of, traditional ICT development, but with the advancement of AI, data analytics, and other things, we believe that these principles enshrined in this ordinance are definitely being stretched to its limit. And in the age of big data and AI, very often we do not know when, where, and how our data are being collected. And it is not uncommon at all that the harvesting of these data has no human involvement at all. So in this case, giving of meaningful consent or giving meaningful notifications or obtaining consent are becoming more and more difficult. So it seems that ICT innovations and development is outpacing the regulations. So maybe to reform the law is one of the way out, but while we see AI is still in its infancy, so premature regulations or over-regulations will definitely hinder its development and innovations. So because of the inadequacy of law, solely meeting the regulatory requirements would not be effective enough to protect or live up with the individual's expectations. And this is against this background that we office decided to put up something like an ethical accountability framework, which is a tool to assist organizations to implement ethics in their data processing activities.
Just, Louise, to bring you in on the discussion there with Amy, I think industry here is sort of actually signposting the right things, having AI ethics boards, having councils, really trying to embed that culture of thinking about these privacy issues right at the start of the product development cycle. So I think we'd all agree with Anthony and Lanah's points on that. And what Simon and Amy are describing is a framework that actually puts the robustness around the checks and balances that are needed to try and make sure that we're all moving in a direction we want to. What is it about this particular debate around the use of automation and algorithms with data that makes the CDI necessary, so the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation necessary? What's the gap that you fill by really focusing on the things that you've outlined in your recent strategy paper?
Yeah, so first of all, you might not be familiar with the Centre, so just to give you a quick idea what it is. So this is a recently established independent advisory body that the government set up. We are basically brand new, and we got terms of reference from our government just at the end of last year. So what we've been tasked with is to investigate and advise on how we build a strong, trustworthy system of governments to maximize the benefits of these type of technologies. And we will have the mandate to make recommendations to government that they have to respond to, and we will also provide advice and support to third parties such as regulators and industry, right? And I think there is a clear place for the Centre in this. As we heard from Simon, this is a post-Big Bang world. There's loads of really great thinking and really great initiatives coming from various communities and sectors and companies. So it's a very crowded area with loads of great thinking, but it's somewhat disconnected. So there is a space for greater coordination, convening, and connecting of debates to ensure that best practice gets spread and that we learn from each other. And that's part of the role that the Centre will play, because it will have a cross-sector remit. Do you think the other issue here, and I think, is that there's clearly something around trust and public concern around these attitudes. There is an unease about some of these technologies. This unease is often diffuse, not very well defined. It's often fueled by polarized narratives that the public get told through media or literature or film, right? So what we're actually looking at is the need to have a sort of well-informed society-wide debate, and this is not the domain of one community to think about. This is something that we need to bring together all aspects of community to have a discussion. And the center can serve as a connector between the wider society and government, because we are uniquely positioned to capitalize on all the great thinking existing in the UK and beyond, and have a plug-in straight to government to make recommendations for them. And the last point I would make is, this is, again, in our post-Big Bang world, it's uncertain. We don't really know always what the impact is going to be, who's going to be most affected, how benefits and harms are going to be distributed around individuals and society. And the center, there isn't really equivalent of this kind of body anywhere around the world. So to some extent, we're first movers, so we kind of have to figure out how we best add value. But one of our really strengths is that although we directly connect to the government, we are outside of government. We're independent. We are advised by an independent chair and board, which allow us to be insulated against some of the political pressures and the political cycles, and able to take a long-term systemic view across all of these things. So, I mean, I think there's I think that, to be honest, I think the success of the center is really dependent on how well we can capitalize and translate some of the great thinking that's already happening. And it's going to be an exciting period going forward.
And Lanah, just to pick up on something Louise was touching on earlier around the general sense of unease, because I don't think it's limited to any one sector or one type of technology company or one particular issue that's emerged, but a general feeling of, do we trust the technology and the systems that we have? Although we might really value products and services that we use every single day, how do you, as a global brand who operates beyond just the UK's jurisdiction, but GDPR has powers that allows us to extend beyond that, but as a global brand that thinks about customers in lots of different territories, how do you deal with that general unease that's emerging, because it's affecting the trust in the brand?
In many ways, and the starting point is that user trust is absolutely paramount to us and to our business. Putting the user first is really a guiding principle and has been. And the way to maintain that user trust, that is done through a variety of things. Obviously, compliance with the law is a requirement wherever we operate, and that's only a baseline. But we do go beyond that. We've made public a number of principles that we have committed to abiding by, not just in Europe. So a lot of these principles on privacy that we made public in September will sound very familiar to a European audience. Many of them take root in principles that are those of the OECD, that are found in the GDPR. So in Europe, they're quite obvious: user notice and consent, transparency, purpose limitation, etc. Google has committed to applying these everywhere, including in places where they are not law. So there are a certain number of principles that we have publicly and strongly committed to. That is just one element, of course, but our user tools are another important one.
And I think, David, just the sorts of things Louise was saying just a few minutes ago around bringing in lots of different communities, lots of good thinking already going on. Google, Lanah's just talked about the sorts of principles that Google adheres to. Are you finding with the work that you're doing and the research that you're doing with the Turing that we're all focused on the right sorts of principles, and are they being actually translated into action in corporations? So do they actually make a difference to products that are being shipped?
Well, before I answer your question, I can't resist just responding to something that Louise and Anthony said earlier. I think that the Google ethics principle situation needs a little bit of a backstory. So last April, 4,000 Google employees signed a petition basically demanding that the company drop its $250 million contract with the US military to build image recognition systems for drone warfare. And basically after some resignations and other building resistance, Google basically rewrote their ethical principles. If we recall, the big principle used to be "don't be evil," right? That was the principle, and that actually doesn't find its way into the.
Is that not a sign of adapting to the circumstances and the feedback that they were getting?
Well, exactly, and I think so. I think that something to remember here is that and this is what part of Anthony's point is that the culture is important, and what happened at Google is that the scientists, right? It was the scientists and those who were building the technologies who sort of called the company out on what we could call digital greenwashing, right? In a sense, there's been years now of the avoidance of regulatory capture with a feel-good rhetoric. Tim Wu, the legal scholar, talks about who's going to regulate the Red Cross if you think about the connectivity rhetoric of Facebook or the various feel-good principles of trust that are coming from Google. And so it's important to remember that the kind of the internal culture of the scientists is really what sort of forced the adjustment. And also, in a sense, it's something we have to pay attention to, that there's a kind of, I would say, what's been called a failed quest of Silicon Valley to save the world. We will save the world. Citizens and data subjects will save the world. It won't be rhetoric, coming from the top. Now, to respond to your direct question, I would say that there's a kind of anarchy of principles right now. There's a lot of principle statements. I would say within the last couple years, there's probably been about 36 or so principle statements across firms and nonprofits and governments. And they're largely based on two sets of beliefs. One is bioethics, which we would understand as respecting persons and principle of autonomy, care, non-maleficence, beneficence. And then the other strain is human rights. And so both of these kind of sets of values are funding, in a large part, most of the bigger kind of framework values. That being said, already we can see, in a sense, there might be a lack of diversity here, right? That are these, global principles, or are they emerging from different parts of our kind of Anglo-American, Anglo-European situation? I would say a hopeful example of a new perspective comes from the IEEE's new set of ethically aligned design principles, where they actually try to incorporate some non-Western beliefs into the mix.
I'd like, sorry, Lanah, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I'd love to respond to a couple of points. The first I want to make is that the conversation about ethics predates and will continue well beyond the events of last spring, and that's the nature of the ethical conversation, right? This might have been something that was very public and a debate that happened very publicly, but it is a conversation that happens in the company on an ongoing basis, including before that. And then the second thing I take issue with a little bit is what you mentioned, what you call rhetoric. And I want to say that these aren't just words, right? Yes, these are principles that we published, but they're also powerfully backed up by facts, and pretty powerfully. So our privacy principles are backed up by the user tools that exist and the user controls that exist, and anyone can pull up their phone and go to myaccount.google.com and see what these are like. Now, reasonable people can argue whether they're perfect or imperfect, but they are there, and they are powerful tools. Our AI principles are backed up by things like our Machine Learning Fairness Initiative, which is also available online. There are concrete tools there to do things like evaluate whether data sets are representative, see how your machine learning model behaves. So we put our money where our mouth is.
So I think, Simon and Amy, I'd like you to come in a second, but Anthony, just picking on this sort of conversation around, sometimes good intentions don't result in good action and good outcomes, right? So sometimes you might fail on the first try or even on multiple tries, but the sorts of things that we need to really bring to life in this ethics debate around the sorts of intended and unintended consequences, we can't just hide those away. We need to incentivize that culture shift. So for the data protection officers in the audience, what can they actually go away and do to try and take some of this conversation we're having and try it with the board, think about the product teams and engineering teams? What's Tech UK been doing to try and incentivize that?
So I think it's maybe useful to wind back a little bit, because why are we talking about ethics? I mean, why has there been this sort of this kind of big flourishing of this ethics debate? I think it's really about the acceleration in technology that we've seen, particularly over the last 5 years, in terms of the way in which AI is now being kind of very widely used in lots of different contexts. the way in which other technologies are then coming together, IoT, sensors, and so on. So we're seeing this sort of acceleration in terms of what technology can do. And I think, a lot of people within the sector are starting to understand both the opportunities and the risks that come and that could come from the broad application of these technologies into different areas. And people are starting to recognize the need to be mindful about how these technologies are built, how they're applied, and how they're used on an ongoing basis. And so, and I think it's interesting because in many ways, data protection was the first big ethical question. Privacy and data protection were the first big ethical questions that were very obvious as we entered into the digital world. And now we have this absolute plethora of questions that are so broad, we just have to put an ethics label on them because we can't define even the questions because they're so wide. And that means that we're going to have to start thinking differently in terms of how we approach this, because we cannot simply rely on legislation and regulation to answer all the questions that need answering. You've got to come at this with a different approach. And so, and over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had these big debates around ethical frameworks. I mean, I've lost count of the number of ethical frameworks that have been published. But they broadly have the same kind of characteristics as was described. And actually, they're not that complicated. It's really about thinking about the implications of the application of this technology for individuals, for society, and for the environment as well, I think. But what does that all then mean on a daily basis for businesses and companies that are applying technologies? It means that that there is an additional dimension that I think we all have to think about now when we're applying these technologies, because these technologies are becoming so profound and so powerful.
Anthony, just on that point, can I just ask a question to Simon and Amy?
Yeah.
This additional dimension, is it an additional overhead? Right, so to put the rubber where the road is, rubber meeting the road, does industry really need to invest in the fact that actually you have to go beyond just compliance with GDPR? You have to really start to think about these sorts of issues coming through. How do you actually square that circle a little bit around the overhead that might come from this?
So I don't regard it as an overhead at all. I think it's about developing technology well, and actually the process of thinking about ethics will often result in a better product, a better service, a better application of the technology, because it means that you've been more thoughtful and mindful about how you go about it. So from a Tech UK perspective, we don't see ethics as an overhead at all. We think about it as doing business well.
Well, I would actually go a bit further and say, especially for the people in this room, ethics is a fantastic opportunity. Because, and Anthony, I love your phrase around data protection being the first big ethics question. Sounds like Captain America being the first Avenger. And now we're going into an Avengers Assemble type thing. There's more things buzzing around, and we can, don't know who's Hulk, or we can talk about that later. But ethics is coming your way. That's a given. But also, there's nobody better placed in your organization to take that challenge on, because the themes we're dealing with ethics are very similar to the themes we've dealt with for years and years with data protection. It's fairness, it's accountability, it's transparency. So the people in this room have the skill set to deal with this new challenge. And it's a career opportunity. It's a way for you to be going to your boards and senior management and saying, you are going to get challenged again and again about whether you're doing the right thing. Now, Google, because you are big and important, do amazing things, are having to go through this process in public. And I have both sympathy for you, and at the same time, you've got the bruises to show it. But for most people, you're going to be able to go to your board and your senior management and say, this is coming your way. And what is happening with Google is going to happen with us as well. And I have the skills to help you deal with it. So I think there's a real personal upside for this as well, for the skill set that exists within the data protection community.
Louise, you and I were talking earlier about another community that's really important alongside DPOs and alongside engineers and product, which is members of the public, right? So the customers, members of the public who really are interfacing with all of these digitally enabled products and services. What's the role in engaging them? I mean, we all say we should engage the public. It's almost taken as a given, right? We should really focus on our customers. But how do we actually make that something that's meaningful to them?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear, and this is a discussion we had before as well. Is this is a really complex issue, right? And it's not for one community to decide. So the debate needs to be inclusive. Whether that is not about the kind of values that we are embedding into it, but also the shape of the debate that Simon and Anthony's been talking about, the amount of sort of agreement you can have when you have a fairly abstracted discussions around accountability and transparency and fairness. We all agree that those are good things, right? And we are now seeing a movement to debate, and it's great, but that where we're moving down to see, well, how do we actually implement this in practice? And this is where we're getting more conflict. So we're in a good place, and seeing conflict in different views is a good thing to do. But you're absolutely right. These debates need to involve not only the people that use the technology, develop the technology, regulate the technology, buy the technology. Good public engagement is a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's something, at least in the center, we're thinking about how to do very effectively. We're in a very unique position in that we can be a visible beacon for representing some of these views. So in the center, for example, we're going to do nationwide public dialogue and engagement around issues around targeting, and our people are being targeted online by through use of data about them and individuals around them. But it is not a easy fix. It's not a question of just asking the public once, but it's how do you embed it continuously. And what you also find when you do some of these dialogue or engagement with public is that people are really sensitive to context. And this is the other thing. The debate currently is really abstracted, and we all think transparency is good, as I said, but what people's views are, what transparency is, what fairness is, really depends on the context in which the technology they're using. So you need to do it continuously, and you need to embed it in the processes as long as along all the other really sort of thoughtful issues around accountability and corporate governance that Anthony was talking about.
Have any of the panel, Louise, yourself, but any of the panel started to see that conversation as it's moving down from the abstract, we all agree transparency is good, into areas where there is tension? Where are the tensions? Is there a tension, for example, around having diversity in the product and engineering teams to build some of these products, or cognitive diversity, if not lots of the other forms of diversity? How do you start to quantify what you need to do to respond to that? Anybody have a perspective? Anthony, any of the community that you represent?
I think we're at an interesting stage in debate, because I think this year in particular is a year where there's a real need to go beyond the frameworks that I think we can all broadly agree with to, as Louise was saying, the practical application, and that's where we'll start to learn things. I think it's going to be a lot more productive. When you're thinking about some of the ethics, this can be in the application in all sorts of areas, like the insurance sector, the automotive sector, retail. All of these companies that are starting to have ethical questions about how they're going to go about applying the next generation of technology and what that can mean, how it can drive better product, better output, but also what implications it has for their customers, for their staff, for their investors, whatever it might be. So we're getting to the stage, I think, where these things are becoming a bit more real and meaningful. I think in terms of the challenge around kind of ethics washing, and I think we only get beyond that when we can actually start to demonstrate how some ethical thinking, the application of these ethical frameworks into a particular context has had an outcome, and hopefully a positive outcome for a community of people or a community of users. And I think that's kind of where we are in this discussion and debate right now. And what I would really hope is this year we start to see a lot more of those kind of practical applications that we can talk about, so that we're not, if we came back in a year's time, we're not still talking about frameworks.
Lanah, as an engineering-led company, what's the sort of lesson that Google might give around how you can actually prove that you've implemented some of these processes and these principles through product, rather than putting out the principles, which all of us are really advocating is a good thing to do, of course, but how do you again manifest that change? So what could some of this community do to go back and talk to their sort of teams to say how we need to start thinking about this?
So I think dialogue within a company and externally as well meeting with users directly, testing products with users directly, taking back those learnings, talking to stakeholders in the policy community and taking back those learnings and sharing them internally with people who build products, having dialogues across functions within the company to make sure that the environment is known by all, that the variables, that the complexity of this debate is understood by all within the company. And I think what this means for people in the audience is that compliance work is not just that, it has a fundamental role to play, feeding into the company culture as well, and feeding into the building of products from the outset.
And maybe Simon or Amy, I mean, if this works well, great. You know, we have organization cultures that are really thinking about the trade-offs around productivity and shipping product, but also around these sorts of questions. If it doesn't work, what do you do? How do you hold accountable communities, industries, sectors around these sorts of issues as they emerge? And to the points that have been made across the panel, this environment is moving so quickly. How do you keep up with the changes to be able to judge when trade-offs are not acceptable?
Well, I think there's a practical challenge there first. So before I joined the ICO, I was a consultant, was involved in many, many GDPR programs. And very often those big programs were the first time that the data protection officer engaged with other parts of the organization. Not completely, but they're meeting new people, they're having new conversations, often with engineers, sometimes with marketers. It's just, it really raised the volume a bit. I'm sure everybody here met new people through their GDPR work that they had not met before in their organizations. And so now we're saying, great, and now you're going to do ethics as well, and you're going to actually be really big picture, and you're going to be really pushing on diversity of thought and looking around corners. That's a big ask. On Monday afternoons, I always like to quote a German philosopher or two. I find it relaxes me.
Me too.
And today I'm going to refer to Jürgen Habermas.
One of my favorites, Simon.
It's actually a very simple idea and a very sensible idea, I think. He focuses on procedural ethics. He says, look, we're never going to get to a stage globally where we get a set of values that everyone can agree on because there's just too much differing opinions out there, not just around the world, but even in each country. So the best we can do is really contemplate who is going to be affected by a business decision, and then make sure that during the engagement, we have engaged with all the different stakeholders. We don't have to agree with everybody, but we need just to make sure there's engagement. And if you think about some of the big ethics and privacy failures we have over the years, it's often been just because organizations haven't done that. They haven't really thought through the consequences on different users and just ignored different groups. So I would go and jump onto Wikipedia if you're so inclined and have a look at his thinking, because I'm doubtless doing him a great disservice. But thinking through, okay, we're not going to necessarily nail every ethical perspective we can get in value statements, but we can make sure that as we make decisions in an organization, we are really engaging with different stakeholders, getting the voices in and then making a decision.
You feel like, David, I feel like you really want to come in there. Simon's described a methodology.
Ali,
Do you have a better German philosopher?
Well, I just have to admit something. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Habermas. So
No way.
You might be pleased with it.
Did I get it right?
I did. In any case, in response to that, I would say that I think as DPOs start to kind of build a culture that can handle these new issues from the ground up, participatory inclusion, democratic value articulation, even in the midst of trade-offs, even in the midst of the clash of beliefs, is so important. I'll just flag that in this current ICO explainability project, which I'm working with Carl Wiper on, we held citizens' juries just this couple months ago, and the one takeaway from these things that was profound. I mean, there's lots of evidence that's coming from that, but the one takeaway is that across the board, the feeling that the jurors had that they had participated in a process that educated them and made them more well-informed consumers was felt to be the biggest takeaway, the most transformative takeaway. And so this is not I think an impossible task to think about public engagement with AI. I think it's just a matter of really building from the ground up, starting with the processes of building out an educated public through, you know, well-informed government, well-informed governance, well-informed regulation, well-informed operationalizable frameworks that bring home the importance of participatory inclusion.
And for everyone else on the panel, you have a different sort of role to play in either enabling that or actually taking that action yourselves, whether it's companies who are engineering-led and building products or representing communities. I mean, we've got about 5 minutes left. I'd just like to get your last sort of thoughts on that, and maybe Louise, starting with you around what do we actually do about the next steps around this?
Well, I was also going to say, we also need to build a trustworthy governance system for the not well-informed consumer. So that's the other thing that we need to think about in terms of the next step of this process. It's not, and you and I were having a conversation about this earlier in the break, it's not necessarily about giving individuals greater control or greater, although those are, of course, are really important, and educating them. It's also building a system that is worthy of a citizen to put their trust in. And I think that is a massive project that will require all the different communities that are represented here, as well as beyond, and as well as the public. Because some of these trade-offs also are trade-offs. We're not going to be able to have ideal outcome for everybody at any given moment, right? Some people in communities will lose out at some times, and other times other communities and individuals will lose out. The thing that we need to do is we need to enable a well-informed public debate and ensure that the governance system that we do have in place is representative of what we as a society value.
Amy, is it the same lesson for you in Hong Kong around how to engage the public, or what are the sorts of different dimensions that emerge from where you operate?
You know, in Hong Kong, we, you know, try to engage, you know, different companies from different sectors and see what they really care about, what they, you know, what they think about what ethics values they think represents. So we, you know, try to work from those values and then to make it into a workable framework and the tools for them to, you know, to put in work to, you know, instill the ethics values in the everyday data processing process.
Anthony and Lanah, just brief responses to something else that, you know, Amy and Louise and others have touched on, especially Louise, that we may be in a situation where not everyone is going to have equal outcomes, right? Some people will be winners, some people will suffer harms more than others. Is that a conversation that the communities you represent and Google, that you're comfortable having? I mean, Louise has quite succinctly presented that perspective, but is that something that you could start to talk about? And the fact that actually the way we develop our products and services means that some people will be disadvantaged through this.
I think it's something Google is comfortable talking about because this is something that is very close to our hearts, that matters a lot to us. And so from my point of view, our machine learning fairness initiative is absolutely 100% focused on that and has developed sort of best practices to try and make sure that this doesn't happen. Testing the machine learning models all the time, testing them against corner cases, making sure that the principles of scientific excellence are upheld. AI, to end on a positive note for me, shouldn't only be seen as a challenge for ethics and for fairness. It can enable them as well, if done right. It can enable fairer outcomes. And so I think putting all the ingenuity in our company at the service of this, that is what I look forward to.
And Anthony, on that point around the opportunity that comes through, just in the last minute or two, just touch on that for me. We were talking about this before.
Well, I mean, what we're talking about is the next generation of digital technologies that are giving us capabilities that we've never had before. The ability to think through and see problems and use data in a way that's never been possible before, I think is going to be pretty useful given some of the scale of the societal and environmental challenges that we face that we've never had before. So I think it's pretty good news, actually, that we've got these technologies coming to the fore because we're going to need them if we're going to tackle climate change and a whole set of other issues. But the reality is these technologies throw up lots of other challenges. The last 20, 25 years, the big challenge around living in a more data-driven world has been about what are the implications for privacy and for the protection of personal data. We now have this huge new raft of other issues that we describe as under this label of ethics, things about what about prediction, bias, explainability. And these are challenges that we're not going to be able to address them retrospectively. We've got to think forward about where the risks are, where the opportunities are, and we've got to build cultures within organizations that have got the capability for that forethought that we've never had to really embed before because we didn't have technologies that were quite this powerful. And I think that's, for me, I think, that's the one thing message I'd like people to take away from today, which is this is a new era. We've got this confluence of new technologies coming on. They're incredibly powerful. They can do brilliant things, massive opportunities for companies and for individuals, but there are some substantial and significant risks. And there's a need to come at this from a more proactive approach. And the work that's been done over the last few years on ethics and ethical frameworks is the starting point. And we're now getting into the phase of implementation. And it's a very exciting time, and data protection and what we've learned about privacy and data protection is going to be a cornerstone of getting this right.
To finish on this note of optimism, I want to do a little plug for the ICO, especially because I should have explained Simon is also my boss. So there's a chance for me to hit one of my objectives on this. But actually, we've created the facility within the ICO for you to come and experiment, right? So the sandbox was discussed earlier, the grants program, the framework which we'll be applying internally ourselves around helping our operations colleagues to understand how to audit these systems is something that Ruben, who's in the room as well, will be sharing. We're blogging about it. How much is your focus, Simon, on that proactive nature around helping DPOs and organizations get ahead of these issues before they become issues? I mean, is it almost a given, but paint a picture around it?
Well, I think it's critical, and I think it's critical that the ICO carries on being a robust regulator that identifies and cracks down on harms and enforces when it should enforce, but should also focus on the upside, because the upside is preventing harms. And so by being engaged in projects early on, by being engaged in change and being engaged in challenging but interesting questions like ethics, enables data protection officers to be involved in other parts of the organization and head off some of these issues before they become enforcement cases, before harm actually occurs. So that's why I think that it's very important at the ICO we have both sides of the coin, and it's not one against the other. It's very much that they're very complementary efforts.
Now, we've run out of time. I'm getting the sort of red card you must get off. One more sort of reference to Man United, maybe, but anyway, never mind. But we've come to the end of this session, so can you please put your hands together for the panel and the conversation? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.